this video, we'll have a look at provider repositories and service view in Specmatic Insights. Let's first try and understand what's a contract repository. A contract repository is the source of truth for your contracts. Now, it's critical to have a well-defined source of truth for your contracts so that your providers and consumers always point to the same contract. Now, we recommend treating your contracts as code, and hence the contract repository should ideally use a version control system like Git. This allows all stakeholders to collaborate on the contracts through a PR or MR process. Specmatic supports three types of contract repositories. The first is called the central contract repository. In this, all the contracts are stored in a single repository. So all providers and consumers will point to this single central contract repository for their contracts. Next, we have federated repositories in which there can be multiple contract repositories based on, say, something like department or business unit or any other grouping. Providers and consumers will then point to the relevant contract repository which has their contract. The third option is called provider repositories, which is the topic of this video. In this, the contracts are stored in the provider repositories. So for the providers, the contracts are local, whereas the consumers point to the provider repository. Let's see an example of this. Let's consider a Web BFF API service which implements an open API specification called webbff.yaml. It also consumes another open API specification called pricing.yaml, which is implemented by the pricing API service. So what happens is that the WebBFF YAML specification is stored in the WebBFF API repository, whereas the pricing.yaml specification is stored in the pricing API service repository. The WebBFF API service points to the pricing API repository to refer to the pricing.yaml specification. Now, what happens is when we run contract tests for both these services and publish the test reports to Specmatic Insights, this is the kind of visualization that you'll get to see in the service view. So let's see this in action. Okay, so let's first take a look at the WebBFF API repository. We can see that the WebBFF YAML spec or contract is stored in a folder called specs within the same repository, which has the code for the WebBFF API service. So this makes it a provider repo wherein the contract that it provides resides in the same repository. If we take a look at specmatic.yaml, we can see that we've defined the system under test as WebBFF API. It uses a source of type file system to point to the specs directory, which has the WebBFF YAML contract that it provides. We've also defined a dependency called pricing API, and it uses a source of type Git and points to the pricing API provider repo. So the WebBFF API service points to the pricing API provider repo for the pricing.yaml contract that it consumes. Now let's take a look at the pricing API repository. We can see that just like the WebBFF API, we have pricing.yaml contract being stored in a folder called specs. And this is in the same repository which has the code for the pricing API service. So this also makes it a provider repo, wherein the contract that it provides resides in the same repository. If we look at Specmatic.yaml, we can see we've defined the system under test as pricing API. And pricing API points to a source called local specs. Local specs is of type file system, and it points to the specs directory, which has a contract that it provides. Okay, so before we proceed, let's take a quick look at how Specmatic Insights looks as of now. So we've created a demo organization called Provider Repos.org, to which the WebBFF API and the pricing API services belong to. And right now you can see that the dashboard is entirely empty. There's nothing here. And the reason for this is we have not yet sent any reports, any contract test reports to Insights. Once we start sending contract test reports to Insights, we'll see those services appearing in the service view over here. Okay, so let's see how we can generate and publish these reports. Let's get back to the WebBFF API repository. Now, there are two types of reports that we need to generate and publish to Insights from each provider repository. The first is called the spec metadata report, which is essentially an inventory of all the specifications that are present in the repository. This is how it looks like. So as we can see, we just have one specification, WebBFF YAML, in the provider repository, and that is included in the spec metadata report. Now, apart from this, when we run contract tests, there are a bunch of CTRF reports which are generated, and they also need to be published to Insights. This is how they look. So this is an example of a test CTRF report. Now, ideally, the generation of these reports and posting them to Insights, this whole orchestration should ideally be implemented in your CI workflow. So let's take a look at how a typical CI workflow would look like. So this is our workflow file. And we can see that there are two main jobs in the workflow. First, the spec metadata report job, and the next job is contract tests. So we ideally want to run the spec metadata report job when there are changes made to our specifications. So let's see what all steps are involved as part of this job. So if we first run Specmatic linter on all the specs, we validate all the examples. Then we run a backward compatibility check to ensure that no consumers are affected due to the changes that we've made. And then we finally generate the spec metadata report and publish it to Insights. Let's take a look at the contract tests job. So in this, we start the web BFF app, start the pricing mock, then actually run the contract tests, and then we publish those CTRF test reports to Insights. So this is how a typical workflow looks like to integrate it with Insights. And now let's try and actually trigger this workflow and see what happens. So this is the web BFF API GitHub repository, and this is the CI workflow. Now for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to trigger the workflow manually. Okay, so the workflow has been triggered. And we'll do the same for the pricing API repository as well, whose workflow is very similar to the one that we saw just now. Okay, so this workflow is triggered as well. So both workflows are triggered now. We'll wait for a sec for these to complete. Okay, so the web BFF API build is green and the pricing API build is green as well. So let's take a look at how the dashboard looks. Great. So we can see both web BFF API and pricing API displayed in the service dependency graph. Let's go through the dashboard one by one. On top, we have some charts and graphs, and we'll cover these in a separate video. The service dependency graph essentially shows you all the services in your organizations and how are they interconnected with each other. Right now, we only have WebBFF API and pricing API, and we can see that the pricing API service is a dependency of the WebBFF API service. Below, we have two tabs, service listing and spec repo listing. The service listing tab is what we call the service, which is essentially an inventory of all the services in your organization. Whereas the spec repo listing tab shows you all the contract repositories or spec repositories in your organization. Let's take a look at the service view first. Okay. So if we expand this, this is how it looks. So every service is displayed in a service block with its dependencies on the right and consumers on the left. So if we take a look at the web BFF API service block, we can see that it implements the web BFF YAML specification, and the pricing API service is a dependency of the web BFF API service by virtue of web BFF API consuming the pricing.yaml contract. And this dependency is notified by this arrow over here. Similarly, if we look at the pricing API service block, we can see that it implements the pricing.yaml service, and the web BFF API service is shown as a consumer. So both relations are displayed in the respective service blocks effectively. And so the service view is quite helpful in identifying first all the services that you have in the organization and how are they interconnected with each other. Now let's take a deep dive into each of these service blocks. Let's start with the web BFF API service block. We can see that it implements 10 operations and endpoints from the web BFF YAML specification, and pricing API is listed as a dependency for the web BFF API service, and it consumes one out of the two operations that the pricing API service provides. So if we click on this green box, we'll get to see a drawer which explains these operations and endpoints in detail. So we see that the web BFF API service implements the WebBFF YAML specification. These are those 10 endpoints that are listed here. And we can see an unused tag against each of these endpoints. And this is because, as of now, WebBFF API does not have any consumers. So there is no other service which is consuming or using any of these endpoints. And hence, all these endpoints are tagged as unused. We have a consumed section in which the pricing API service is listed, and it shows the one operation that the WebBFF API consumes from the pricing API service, which is post quote price. Okay. Now let's go to the pricing API service block. We see that it implements two operations and endpoints from the pricing.yaml specification. WebBFF API is listed as a consumer here, and it shows that same relation that it consumes one out of the two operations that are provided by the pricing API service. If we click on the pricing API green block, we'll get to see details of these operations. So these are the two operations that the pricing API service provides. We see the unused tag only against one of these operations because the other operation, post/quote price, is used by the WebBFF API service. We have a used by section over here, which shows the WebBFF API service as a consumer and the operation that it consumes. So the service view is quite helpful in not only understanding the interconnections between your services in terms of how they depend on each other, but also to the level of detail of the actual operations that they provide and consume. Now let's take a look at this view build history button that we see. So if we click on this, we can see a list of all the builds that have been submitted for the service. Since we have just submitted one build right now, so we see just the one build listed over here. If we click on it, we'll get to see a detailed report of all the operations that are present in the specification and whether they have been covered by contract tests. So pricing.yaml has two operations, and both these operations are covered by contract tests. If I click on an operation, we'll get to see the list of all the contract tests that were actually executed in terms of the request made and the response received. So it's a quite detailed report, which has details on all operations and the actual tests as well. So if we go back and have a look at the same for the WebBFF service as well. So we again see the one build that we have submitted. If we click on this, we get to see these 10 operations that are implemented by the service. And all these operations are covered in contract tests. You can again click on any operation to see the actual tests that were executed. Let's go back to the dashboard. So hopefully this gives you a bit of an overview on what provider repos are and how they can be visualized in Insights and the kind of integration that is needed from your CI workflow to enable this. Now, currently, what we see here is a very simplistic representation of an organization which just has two services. If you want to see a more realistic representation with multiple services and multiple services consuming each other, this is how it could look. Okay, so this is a more realistic demo organization that we have, which has a bunch of services all interconnected with each other in multiple ways. So in the service view, we can see all the services listed over here. And if you want to look at a more realistic WebBFF, this is how it would look. So the WebBFF has a web front-end consumer, and then it consumes these many services. So these are the dependencies of the WebBFF service. We can see it also has an async dependency. So we can see how the service view and this whole Insights dashboard is quite helpful in firstly getting an inventory of all your services and visualizing each of their dependencies and consumers with this kind of a visualization. This demo org is freely available for you to browse and access. So please go through it at your leisure. And that pretty much concludes our demo on provider repos and the service view. Thanks for watching.